Coming to you live, it is your host, Mr. Lou, with another banging episode of Highly Unpolitical. For all of you guys stateside, you've just come off of Labor Day weekend, much needed rest for the working man. Now, for some of you, you might have a notion of Labor Day and the celebration, but what's really important to remember about Labor Day is that it's based in the struggle by American workers for working rights, and a lot of these rights that we enjoy today came from these workers' rights movements in the post-industrial revolution era. And the city where I'm from and where my host, Mr. Jojo, is from, Lawrence, Massachusetts, in the early part of the 20th century, played a really important role in fighting for these rights, for workers' rights. Children's working rights as well. Back in that era, you had 8-10-year-old children working 18-hour days. Mr. Jojo, welcome onto the show once again. So you're on the ground in Lawrence, lived there most of your life. Tell us a little bit about Bread and Roses, why it's important, and some of the details that a lot of our viewers might be interested in.
Good night, guys. Mr. Jojo over here in Lawrence, Mass. Forgive my voice. Been a long weekend, Labor Day weekend. So I'm gonna be kind of a little monotone and just sipping on some water. So Labor Day weekend, and I gotta say, for most of my life, I never knew what Labor Day was. Maybe until I obviously started working and paying taxes and stuff. And unbeknownst to us, even living in this place in Lawrence, Mass, in the ground zero of union labor and unionizing of workers in the ground, we never really got taught this in school. So when I got older, I got into the local history and stuff. And in 1912, over 100 years ago, Lawrence workers, textile workers, that worked, I gotta say, I think it was about 80 to 90 hours a week, and during the Industrial Revolution, making textile, making shoes, making quilts and all types of textile. So during the turn of the century, there were about Eastern Europeans coming, as well as Italians, Irish. So in Lawrence, you had about 20 different ethnicities speaking about over a dozen different languages. During the time that people were actually dying due to the conditions in the mills, lung problems, overheating, little kids working, talking about 4 or 5 years old. Today, the estimate of having a pretty good lifestyle is spending about 30 to 35% of your income on housing. At that time, it was 70% that went to rent.
So you're saying that a lot of these workers were working sort of cyclical, work all day, pay my house, and have no type of income to invest in anything else, to leisure, none of this. I mean, it was just glorified slave labor, if you want to call it that. That's the period that we're talking about here, right?
Yep. So you had all this stuff going on in a very segregated city where there was about, like I said, over 20 different ethnicities in 7 square miles, all like broken up in small neighborhoods. Eventually people started actually dying. That's when people actually kind of pick up on any social movement, when people's life is at risk.
That's an unfortunate, it's an interesting point, bringing it back to things that are happening today in the United States. Is things don't become real until someone dies, and that's when people are like, oh yeah, and so instead of avoiding the death and avoiding the loss of a life, we wait till the person dies, and then we say, oh, okay, sorry,
we go with the most extreme cases. During this time when they were fighting in the courts for equal wages, the attorneys for the people would have the 4th or 5th worst cases, scenarios playing out, which were real, but they're obviously trying to win a case, so they're picking the worst of the worst and put it in the American courtrooms for everybody to see.
Now, I remember from from back in grade school going on these school trips, and just to give some of our viewers who are not from Massachusetts, just kind of want to give you guys a sort of a map. In Massachusetts, about half an hour north of the city of Boston, the capital of Massachusetts, there is a river called the Merrimack River, and around this time, 1820s, 1830s, a lot of small cities start popping up on this river, the Merrimack River, and they dedicate themselves, like Jojo was saying, to making shoes, making so on and so clothing, and Lawrence, the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, actually had a train line that was one of the first trains in all of the United States, and it was able to go from Lawrence to Boston in a time of 27 minutes, which at the time was a record pace. And so the city of Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then you had cities like Lowell, you had cities like Haverhill, Massachusetts, were at the cutting edge of this industrial movement. So when you think of an industrialized nation and what that means, it means that you went from picking cotton and selling cotton and then having someone make a shirt with needles to having large machines do it for you. So you're cutting down on time, you're cutting down on cost, and you're increasing your production. And what I remember from school was that, and going back to this question of equal wages and rights and protection, is that the reason that the mill owners, that's what they would call these large mills, the reason that mill owners wanted 5, 6, 7-year-olds to work at the factories was because they had small arms and small fingers. And in these looms, which were these large machines that would physically make the clothing, when they would get stuck, they would have these kids put their arms in to try to jiggle out the needles. And so you had I wouldn't call it an epidemic, but a large number of kids would have their arms cut off. And so the context that I want to give to some of our listeners is, you complain about a 40-hour day today, a 40-hour week, and workers' rights, and if we look back at how things were, we have to be thankful for these rights movements and these labor movements that we're celebrating on a Labor Day. So that's just, I wanted to give our viewers that context.
Yeah, so just a quick description of the actual strike. It lasted 2 months, and there was translators from all across the world and obviously country coming together and kind of pretty much translating all these different groups and just come.
So did the strike have a name? Was
the bread and roses strike?
So
I think it was named after a poem that described I'm not 100%, but I think it was a poem that described the strike. It was named after.
So basically, during the bread and roses strike, so these workers are uniting and they strike for 2 months.
And they're not getting paid, so this is not like a modern strike.
This was...
there's no unions before. This strike's not because there's unions. There's no unions, so they're striking just to strike. I don't even think it's called a strike. I think it was just, I'm not going to work.
I was like, shit, I'm going to take 2 months off and whatever. Figure this shit out later.
So think about the logistics of this stuff, right? Similar to the bus boycotts of Montgomery that started with Rosa Parks, where you have to kind of make adjustments to your everyday needs, So it requires a lot of logistical changes and coming together, and who's going to take care of the kids, and who's going to eat, who's going to share this. So it requires a lot of work. And then you're talking about people that can even speak to one another.
Well, here's an interesting thing that I'm thinking about. Bread and Roses seems like this sort of like just this moment in history that I would imagine very few people, let's say outside of Lawrence, don't know about, and yet had an impact on basically the way that we function in the workplace today.
But internationally, like the whole world. Like there was no other place in the world that even like union and thought about that we're going to like negotiate with our owners and our managers.
Yeah, so it's a concept. It's a concept that today it's normal. I'm a part of a union, the police union, the doctors union, the lawyers union, whatever union. But I think the interesting thing, at least for me, is you have this moment that changes the world, and now we're looking at the way things are in the United States, for example, where government and some elements in government are trying to cut down on these very same rights. We have some states, I think Minnesota or Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, I think 2 years back, it basically was overhauling the state constitution with relation to workers' rights, limiting the amount of overtime, limiting the power of unions, limiting all of these just rights that people fought for at the turn of the century.
So, and then it takes us to what happened this past week, where the Market Basket, the Mula's brand and family, came to an agreement, and it's going to continue. And this stuff is making national news, given the fact that it's Labor Day weekend. A major supermarket chain would cater towards low-income families, and people just didn't show up to work and said we ain't showing up until the right guys in charge.
Now that
lasted about 6 weeks,
and that was an interesting case as well. Again, for our listeners who are outside of Massachusetts and outside the United States, Market Basket is a local chain in the state of Massachusetts and New Hampshire that is run by the DeMoulas family. And it turns out that earlier in the summer, there was a dispute within the family in terms of control of the supermarket chain. And employees and customers basically joined together and they said, we're not going to shop at the supermarket until the man that we want in charge is in charge.
Yeah.
And for 6 weeks, people just you're talking about supermarkets that didn't have anything on the shelves, people boycotting and picketing outside of the supermarkets, local farmers, which were heavily affected by this because large supermarket chains nowadays, they get their products from large companies, and so small farmers don't have a place to sell their goods. But at a chain like Market Basket, you have small vendors who are selling natural tomatoes and fruits and vegetables and so on, and they weren't able to sell. And so people just kind of said, well, okay, that's enough. That's not how we want our supermarket to function. And they kind of banded together, and it was announced, a week ago that Arthur T. DeMoulas was going to be the man who was going to run the supermarket chain, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's pretty much one side of the family that wants to take a pretty corporate, agenda and move forward with just trying to make money, probably just cut your losses. Whereas the people that actually took over, according to them, obviously, want to stay with a fundamental, ideology behind the whole helping out the low income and stuff like that. And to us, that means a lot of minorities as well, because our low income around here really means minorities and some poor whites. Not like diversity up in here, not like Brazil or anything like that.
Well, it's interesting, and this is what we're going to get into in our next segment, and I'm just going to leave you off with this for our listeners with this tidbit. Myself and Mr. Jojo, we're both the children of immigrants, and I remember as a child, and I'm talking about 88, 89, going with my father to a DeMoulas supermarket, and literally having my whole youth associated with the supermarket. And so it was interesting to me the effect that local brands have on people, and how people, when things really do matter, and this seemed to matter to a lot of people, came together to get something done, and they got something done.
And I think a lot of times we forget who are really affected. We thought about the consumers. People complaining on Facebook about this and about being a Stop and Shop and Whole Foods and it's too expensive. But who really walked out and put everything at risk were the workers, people working at the warehouses. It wasn't so much the managers and stuff like that. It was the workers that distributed and filled up the trucks to distribute the food. They stopped working. So if they didn't work, You don't need no managers, cashiers. There's no food to sell.
And
so they were the ones that really did something. I mean, people working for $12, $13 an hour. You know, I mean, you're talking about our grandparents, our fathers, you know, first immigrants. You know, you're talking about the bread and roses strike. This is the new stuff. You know, so how long can we kind of take this? I don't know, man. It seems like a big deal.
I think again, you know, I want to give a context to our listeners who are outside of this area, because sometimes geography really influences us and says, oh, well, that doesn't matter. And I think, like you said, that's that poignant moment where everyone has a stake in it, and then the final guy was just like, well, we're not going to do this as well, because they could have very well wanted to cross over the picket lines and said, oh, well, we'll work, and they didn't. And so, like you said, the delivery guy isn't delivering the food, and the stock boy, he isn't putting it in, the cashier and the manager, and they're all like, well, we're not going to do this. And then you have the consumers who are like, no. And the consumers, and this is a point that I think is interesting, the consumer dictated how they wanted to be treated.
Yeah, because, I mean, I guess they could have kept going, because there was still food on the shelf, you know. It was more the milk, the meats,
the cheeses,
you know, anything that's not in the box, I guess.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting point. They hit them where the pocketbooks hurt, and the consumer dictated how they wanted to be treated, which is, I think, a lesson that needs to be learned by a lot of us nowadays, where we pay for services and we act like we're doing the businesses a favor, you know. And
yeah. So I mean, probably to end this point, this segment at least. We got to see what we're going to do moving forward in regards to unions and how do we actually utilize them to actually make a change or sustain a particular, you know, foundation like Market Basket did. I think the next big one is going to be teachers unions. This also takes us to one of the first episodes when we talked about what do we do with cops. And I think the only thing they could do to really see a change is what the union does. The union got to be behind some type of policy change in order for anything to really happen.
I think, and that's a beautiful point to end our segment. To our listeners out there, remember what Labor Day means. It's not just a day that you can go home, drink some beer, have a barbecue. It is literally a recognition of the work that's been done. And like my man Jojo just said, going forward, with a lot of these issues that we're having in this country, unions will play a role. And not just unions, it's people coming together. Unions are an easy way for that to happen, but you know, it's not just the police department that's going to make the change. Citizens need to take responsibility as well. And the Market Basket case was an example of that, where the workers did their part and then the consumer did their part as well. We're going to take a break right now. We'll be back in a few minutes with our second segment, and we just want to take you to our musical minute and check out this song called All Day Music. We'll be right back on Highly Unpolitical.